Days before her wedding, a respected teacher walked into her school for a routine task and never returned. In a quiet town where nothing seemed out of place, one brief encounter changed everything. What followed uncovered hidden obsession, careful investigation, and a truth no one expected. Stay with this story. In the rural heart of Leeton, life moved at a steady and predictable pace. Known for its close-knit community and peaceful surroundings, it was the kind of place where people greeted each other by name and routines rarely changed. Schools, local shops, and community events formed the backbone of everyday life. Among those who called this town home was Stephanie Scott, a young teacher whose future seemed full of promise. She was known for her warmth, dedication, and the genuine care she showed toward her students. Colleagues described her as thoughtful and reliable, someone who brought quiet energy into every room she entered. Outside of work, Stephanie's life was entering an exciting new chapter. She was preparing for her upcoming wedding to her fiancé, Aaron Quinlivan. The couple had built their relationship on shared values and a clear vision for the future. Friends and family recall how the two complemented each other, creating a sense of stability and happiness that felt lasting. As the wedding day approached, Stephanie was balancing both her personal and professional responsibilities. She had taken leave from her teaching role at Leeton High School, but in the days leading up to the ceremony, she returned briefly to finalize lesson plans for the teacher who would be covering her classes. It was a simple act of responsibility, consistent with her character. On the morning of April 5, 2015, Stephanie arrived at the school. It was a quiet day, with minimal activity on campus. Being a weekend, the usual sounds of students and staff were absent. The environment was calm, almost still, providing the perfect setting for her to complete her work without interruption. At the same time, another individual was present on the school grounds, Vincent Stanford. Stanford was a cleaner employed at the school. He was known to staff, but largely kept to himself, maintaining a low profile as he carried out his duties. There was nothing outwardly unusual about his presence that day. As a cleaner, he had access to the premises and often worked during off hours. This overlap, Stephanie returning briefly and Stanford performing his routine tasks, created a moment that would later become central to the investigation. At this stage, there were no signs of concern. Stephanie had informed her fiancé that she would be heading to the school and expected to return shortly. It was meant to be a quick visit, part of tying up loose ends before stepping into a new phase of her life. However, as time passed, something began to feel off. Stephanie did not return home as expected. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. For someone known for her reliability, this silence was unusual. Concern quickly grew among those closest to her. Aaron, along with family members, began trying to piece together her last known movements. The fact that she had gone to the school provided a starting point, but it also raised questions. Why hadn't she come back? What could have delayed her? By the afternoon, worry had turned into urgency. Local authorities were notified, and initial efforts to locate Stephanie began. Police treated the situation seriously from the outset, recognizing that her sudden disappearance did not align with her known behavior. The school became a key focus. Officers arrived to assess the premises, looking for any indication of what might have happened during Stephanie's visit. Given the limited number of people present that day, investigators began narrowing down who had access to the area at the relevant time. Attention naturally turned toward staff members who had been on site. Among them was Vincent Stanford. At first glance, Stanford did not stand out. He had no immediate history that suggested involvement in a serious incident. However, his presence at the school during the same time frame placed him within the scope of the inquiry. As investigators began speaking with individuals connected to the school, they worked methodically, gathering information and establishing timelines. Every detail mattered: arrival times, movements within the building, and any interactions that may have occurred. Meanwhile, the community of Leeton was beginning to feel the weight of uncertainty. News of Stephanie's disappearance spread quickly. In a town where people were accustomed to feeling safe, the situation was deeply unsettling. Search efforts expanded. Volunteers joined authorities, covering nearby areas and following any possible lead. Hope remained that Stephanie would be found safe, that there was an explanation that would bring clarity without tragedy. But as the hours passed, the sense of unease continued to grow. Investigators focused on reconstructing Stephanie's final known moments. Her car was located at the school, confirming that she had indeed arrived and had not left as planned. This detail reinforced the urgency of the situation. Inside the school, officers conducted a detailed examination of the premises. Classrooms, hallways, and storage areas were all carefully checked. The goal was to identify anything out of place, any sign that could explain what had happened during that quiet morning. At the same time, Vincent Stanford remained part of the investigation. Detectives sought to understand his movements throughout the day, comparing his account with the physical evidence being collected. What began as a missing person case was steadily evolving into something more serious. The calm routine of a small town had been disrupted. A young woman, days away from her wedding, had vanished without explanation. And within the quiet halls of a familiar school, investigators were beginning to uncover details that suggested this was not a simple disappearance. The answers were there, hidden within a narrow window of time and a limited number of individuals. As the investigation moved forward, one thing became clear. This case would demand careful attention, patience, and a commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. The story of Stephanie Scott was no longer just about a missing person. It was becoming a case that would deeply affect a community and leave lasting questions about trust, proximity, and the unseen realities that can exist even in the most familiar places. And at the center of it all was a moment, brief, ordinary on the surface, that would soon be understood in a very different light. As the search for Stephanie Scott intensified, the atmosphere in Leeton shifted from concern to quiet tension. What had started as a missing person case was now being treated with increasing seriousness. Time was critical, and investigators moved quickly to understand what had happened within the walls of Leeton High School. Police began by carefully reconstructing Stephanie's last known movements. Her arrival at the school was confirmed, along with the fact that she had planned only a short visit. Her car remained parked outside, reinforcing that she had not left on her own. Inside the building, attention turned to identifying any signs that might explain her sudden disappearance. The school grounds, usually filled with activity, were now the focus of a detailed forensic examination. Classrooms were checked methodically, corridors were reviewed, and storage areas were inspected with precision. Investigators were looking for anything unusual, any detail that stood out from the normal routine of a quiet weekend. At the same time, officers worked to establish a clear timeline of who had been present that day. Among the few individuals on site was Vincent Stanford. As a cleaner, his presence during off hours was not uncommon. However, the timing of his shift overlapped directly with Stephanie's visit, placing him in a key position within the investigation. Detectives approached their work with caution and professionalism. Initial conversations with Stanford were part of standard procedure, aimed at understanding his movements and whether he had seen or interacted with Stephanie. His account was noted and compared against other available information. As more details emerged, investigators began to examine the consistency of those accounts. During this phase, authorities also reviewed available security systems within the school, including entry points and access records, to better understand movements inside the building. Each piece of information helped narrow the window of time in which events had unfolded. Meanwhile, the search effort outside the school continued to expand. Local volunteers joined police in covering nearby areas, hoping to find any sign of Stephanie. The community's involvement reflected how deeply her disappearance was felt. She was not just a teacher. She was someone people knew, respected, and cared about. Back at the school, forensic teams continued their work. Their focus remained on identifying physical evidence that could clarify what had taken place. The process was careful and deliberate, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. As investigators gathered more information, attention increasingly centered on Stanford's movements throughout the day. Detectives worked to verify his timeline, comparing it with evidence collected from the scene. Authorities also began examining Stanford's background more closely, including his routine behavior at the school and any prior interactions with staff. This step was part of building a broader understanding of his connection to the environment where Stephanie had last been seen. At this point, the investigation was no longer just about where Stephanie might be. It was about understanding the circumstances that led to her disappearance. The quiet nature of the school that day became a critical factor. With limited people present, the number of possible scenarios narrowed. Investigators knew that answers were likely contained within that small window of time and space. For Stephanie's family and fiancé, Aaron Quinlivan, the waiting was difficult. Each passing hour brought uncertainty. They remained in close contact with authorities, hoping for updates, holding on to the possibility of a positive outcome. Within the investigative team, the approach remained steady. Every detail was reviewed, every timeline cross-checked. Detectives worked to ensure that conclusions would be based on clear and reliable evidence. As the inquiry progressed, inconsistencies began to surface. Statements were revisited. Movements were analyzed again. Investigators compared what was said with what could be confirmed. This process gradually sharpened the focus of the case. Vincent Stanford's presence at the school, once just a point of interest, was becoming increasingly significant. Police also conducted detailed interviews with other school staff to confirm there were no additional witnesses or unexpected visitors during that time frame. This helped reinforce the understanding that the situation was confined to a very limited number of individuals. The investigation reached a turning point as detectives began to connect multiple strands of information. Physical evidence from the school, combined with timeline analysis, pointed toward a more defined direction. While authorities remained careful in how they proceeded, the case was steadily moving away from uncertainty and toward clarity. For the community, updates were closely followed. The sense of safety that once defined Leeton had been disrupted. Parents, teachers, and residents looked for reassurance, while also coming to terms with the seriousness of the situation. Search teams continued their efforts beyond the school grounds, working in coordination with investigators. The goal was to locate Stephanie and understand what had happened, bringing answers to her family and the wider community. Inside the investigation, the focus had narrowed considerably. Vincent Stanford was no longer just one of several individuals present. He had become central to the case. Detectives worked carefully, ensuring that every step taken was supported by evidence and aligned with proper procedure. The quiet routine of a small-town school had given way to a complex and deeply serious investigation. What had seemed like an ordinary day was now understood as a critical moment, one that would shape everything that followed. The unanswered questions that began with Stephanie's disappearance are now leading toward resolution, but the full account of what happened and why is still to be revealed. As the investigation reached its most critical stage, authorities in Leeton were no longer searching without direction. The work carried out inside Leeton High School, combined with evidence gathered beyond its grounds, had brought clarity to what had once been a deeply uncertain situation. At the center of that clarity was Vincent Stanford. Detectives had spent days carefully assembling timelines, reviewing physical evidence, and verifying statements. The results pointed consistently in one direction. Stanford, who had initially been just one of the few people present at the school that day, had become the primary focus of the case. As pressure from the investigation increased, inconsistencies in his account became more apparent. His version of events did not align with the evidence collected by forensic teams or the timeline established by investigators. Each discrepancy narrowed the gap between suspicion and certainty. During formal questioning, investigators presented Stanford with key findings from the case, including timeline analysis and physical evidence linking him directly to Stephanie's last known location. This marked a decisive moment in the investigation. Faced with the weight of that evidence, the case moved into its final phase. Authorities confirmed that Stephanie Scott had been attacked inside the school on the morning she arrived to complete her work. What had begun as a routine visit had turned into a tragic event within a setting she knew and trusted. The investigation established that Stanford had developed an unhealthy fixation on Stephanie. This fixation, which had gone unnoticed by those around him, became a key factor in understanding his actions. His role at the school had given him access, and the quiet environment of that day created the circumstances in which the incident occurred. Following the attack, investigators determined that Stanford attempted to conceal what had happened. Evidence showed that he removed items and made efforts to avoid immediate detection, actions that delayed the discovery of the full sequence of events. However, the detailed work of forensic teams and detectives ensured that these efforts did not prevent the truth from emerging. The search efforts that had taken place across the surrounding areas eventually led to the recovery of Stephanie. This development confirmed what investigators had already begun to piece together through evidence and analysis. For Stephanie's family and her fiancé, Aaron Quinlivan, the confirmation brought an overwhelming sense of loss. The future they had been preparing for just days earlier had been suddenly taken away. Their focus shifted from hope to remembrance, supported by a community that shared in their grief. As the investigation concluded, Vincent Stanford was formally charged. The case then moved into the judicial system, where the evidence gathered would be presented in full. During court proceedings, prosecutors outlined a clear and structured account of events, supported by forensic findings, witness statements, and Stanford's own admissions. The goal was to ensure that every detail was examined carefully and that the case was understood in its entirety. At this stage, Stanford's actions were no longer in question. They were documented, analyzed, and presented within a legal framework. In court, it was confirmed that his actions were driven by personal fixation and a deliberate decision to act on that fixation. The evidence demonstrated planning, opportunity, and intent, all of which contributed to the seriousness of the charges. Eventually, Vincent Stanford confessed to his actions. This confession aligned with the findings of investigators and provided final confirmation of the sequence of events. While it did not change the outcome, it removed any remaining uncertainty about responsibility. Following the confession, the court delivered its verdict. Vincent Stanford was found guilty. The sentencing phase reflected the gravity of the case. The court considered the nature of the crime, the impact on Stephanie's family, and the broader effect on the community of Leeton. The final decision was a life sentence with a significant non-parole period, ensuring that he would remain in custody for decades. This outcome brought a measure of closure to a case that had deeply affected many lives. For the community, the impact was lasting. What had once been seen as a quiet and secure environment had been challenged by events that few could have imagined. Schools reviewed their safety procedures, and conversations around awareness and vigilance became more prominent. At the same time, Stephanie's memory remained central to how the community moved forward. She was remembered not for the circumstances of her death, but for the life she lived, her dedication to teaching, her kindness, and the future she had been building. Tributes from students, colleagues, and loved ones reflected a consistent theme. She had made a meaningful difference in the lives of others. In the months that followed, community members organized memorial gatherings and initiatives in her honor, ensuring that her legacy would continue in a positive and lasting way. For Aaron Quinlivan and Stephanie's family, the journey did not end with a court's decision. Their focus turned toward preserving her memory and finding ways to move forward while holding on to what she had meant to them. The case of Stephanie Scott stands as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can change and how important careful investigation is in uncovering the truth. It also highlights the strength of a community coming together in the face of loss. From a quiet morning at a local school to a case that drew national attention, every step of the process was shaped by the commitment to understanding what happened and ensuring accountability. In the end, the story is not defined solely by the crime, but by the response that followed, the determination of investigators, the resilience of a family, and the unity of a community. And through it all, Stephanie Scott is remembered for who she was, a dedicated teacher, a loved partner, and a person whose life, though cut short, left a lasting impact that continues to be felt. a quiet town. A respected teacher vanishes without a trace. For years, no answers, only questions. Then, an unexpected confession changes everything. What really happened that night? And how did the truth stay hidden for so long? Stay with this story as the mystery slowly unfolds into a shocking reality. In the quiet town of Asilla, in Georgia, life followed a steady rhythm. Neighbors knew each other, routines rarely changed, and unexpected events were almost unheard of. It was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, and where a familiar face was part of everyday comfort. That sense of security made what happened in late October 2005 all the more unsettling. Tara Grinstead was known throughout the community. She was a high school history teacher, dedicated to her students and respected by her colleagues. Outside the classroom, she carried herself with confidence, shaped in part by her past in local pageants. She had once been crowned Miss Tifton and remained involved in community events long after. On the evening before her disappearance, Tara attended a local beauty event. It was something she had done many times before, mentoring and supporting young participants. Witnesses later recalled nothing unusual about her behavior that night. She appeared calm, engaged, and in good spirits. After the event, she returned home alone. The next morning, Tara did not show up for work. At first, it seemed like a simple absence. People assumed she might be sick or delayed. But as hours passed with no contact, concern began to grow. Tara was known for being responsible and consistent. Missing a school day without notice was completely out of character. By the afternoon, friends and colleagues decided to check on her. When they arrived at her home, small but troubling details began to emerge. Her car was still parked outside. Inside, everything looked mostly in place, but there were subtle signs that something wasn't right. Personal items she would normally carry with her, like her phone and keys, were missing. Her purse, however, was left behind. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no obvious disturbance that would immediately explain her absence. Yet, the situation didn't feel normal. It felt incomplete, as if her routine had been interrupted. Local authorities were contacted, and an official search began. As investigators looked closer, they treated the situation with growing urgency. The possibility that Tara had simply left on her own quickly became unlikely. Friends and family confirmed that she had no reason to disappear voluntarily. She had plans, responsibilities, and strong ties to the community. Search teams were organized. Volunteers joined law enforcement, combing through nearby areas, roads, and open land. Flyers were distributed, and her story began to spread beyond Asilla. What started as local concern slowly turned into a wider investigation. At the center of it all was a question that no one could answer. What happened between the time Tara returned home that night and the next morning? Investigators began piecing together her final known movements. The timeline was narrow. She had attended the event, spoken with people, and returned home. After that, there were no confirmed sightings. Attention turned to anyone who might have crossed paths with her that evening, or anyone familiar with her routine. Among those who knew Tara were many former students. As a teacher, she had spent years shaping young minds, building relationships with those who passed through her classroom. Most of these connections were positive, rooted in respect and guidance. But in any close-knit community, not every relationship is fully understood. Years later, two names would come into focus: Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes. At the time of Tara's disappearance, both were young men who had grown up in the same area. They were part of the same generation, shaped by the town's routines and expectations. They knew the environment, the neighborhoods, and the people who lived there. Ryan Duke had once been a student at the school where Tara taught. Like many small-town connections, their paths had crossed in a classroom setting. There was nothing publicly known at the time to suggest any direct conflict or concern. Bo Dukes, a close friend of Ryan, shared a similar background. The two were often associated with each other, spending time together and moving within the same social circles. In 2005, however, neither of them stood out to investigators. They were not immediately considered central to the case. The focus remained broad, with law enforcement exploring multiple possibilities. As days turned into weeks, the case began to grow colder. Despite extensive searches and ongoing efforts, there were no clear answers. No confirmed sightings. No direct leads. The lack of evidence made the situation even more difficult to understand. It was as if Tara had simply vanished, without a trace. The community felt the weight of uncertainty. People began locking their doors. Conversations shifted from routine topics to quiet concern. Parents became more cautious. The sense of safety that once defined the town started to fade. Meanwhile, Tara's family continued to push for answers. They stayed visible, speaking to media, keeping attention on the case. They believed that someone, somewhere, knew something. In the months that followed, the investigation expanded beyond local efforts, drawing attention from state-level authorities and specialized units focused on missing persons. Yet even with additional resources, progress remained limited. Time moved forward, but the case did not. Years passed, and Tara Grinstead's disappearance became one of the most talked about unsolved cases in Georgia. It was revisited periodically, with new investigators taking fresh looks at the evidence. Tips would come in, some promising, others leading nowhere. Through it all, one detail remained constant: the mystery of that night. What happened inside that home? Who was there? And why did no one come forward? In a town where people knew each other, silence became part of the story. As the case remained unresolved, the names Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes still sat quietly in the background, unnoticed by most, unconnected in any official sense. At that point, there was nothing linking them directly to Tara's disappearance in the eyes of the public. But that would not remain the case forever. The answers, when they finally began to surface, would reshape everything the community thought it knew. And the quiet town of Wasilla would be forced to confront a truth far more complex than anyone had imagined. In the years following the disappearance of Tara Grinstead, the case remained unresolved, but it was never forgotten. What began as a local concern in Georgia slowly turned into a long-standing mystery that drew attention far beyond the town of Wasilla. Investigators continued to revisit the case, but progress was limited. Without clear evidence or confirmed sightings, each lead seemed to fade before it could provide answers. Still, law enforcement refused to close the file. They believed that time, eventually, would bring something to light. For the community, life had to move forward, but the absence of closure left a lasting impact. People adjusted, becoming more cautious and aware of their surroundings. The case had changed how they viewed their own town. Among those who had grown up in this environment were Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes. By this point, both were no longer teenagers. They had entered adulthood, carrying with them the experiences and choices that came with it. Their friendship remained consistent. They spent time together, shared social circles, and stayed connected over the years. From the outside, there was nothing that clearly linked them to the unresolved case. They were part of the same community that had been affected by Tara's disappearance, just like everyone else. But beneath that surface, their lives followed a different path. Ryan Duke's life over time became increasingly unsettled. He struggled to find direction and stability. Those who knew him described a pattern of inconsistency, moving between jobs, drifting between routines, and rarely maintaining a steady course. Bo Dukes, in contrast, appeared more outwardly stable. He worked, built relationships, and eventually started a family. On the surface, his life seemed more structured, more aligned with the expectations of adulthood. Despite these differences, their connection remained strong. Over the years, the two stayed in regular contact, often meeting privately and maintaining a close personal bond that was not widely examined by others. Meanwhile, the investigation into Tara's disappearance entered a new phase. Advances in technology and renewed interest in cold cases began to reshape how older investigations were approached. Law enforcement agencies started to re-examine existing evidence using updated methods. Interviews were revisited. Old tips were reviewed with fresh perspective. In addition, public interest in unsolved cases began to grow significantly, with media coverage and independent discussions bringing renewed attention to long-standing mysteries like Tara's case. This renewed focus encouraged more people to come forward with information, even if it seemed minor. Investigators understood that in cases like this, even small details could lead to larger breakthroughs. At the same time, pressure quietly built around those who might have known more than they had previously shared. Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes continued with their lives, but the past did not completely fade. In a small town, memories linger. Conversations resurface. People remember connections, even if they don't fully understand them. There were moments over the years when individuals within their extended social circles reportedly questioned past events and behaviors, though nothing concrete was brought forward at the time. For investigators, the challenge remained the same: identifying a clear path forward in a case with very little physical evidence and no confirmed narrative. Still, they persisted. They revisited timelines, re-examined relationships, and looked more closely at individuals who had once been considered peripheral. In long-term investigations, it is often these overlooked connections that become significant. As time passed, subtle shifts began to occur. The case was no longer just about what happened in 2005. It became about what had happened since, what people remembered, what they chose to share, and what they had kept to themselves. Ryan Duke, in particular, remained largely under the radar. He was not publicly associated with the case in any meaningful way. His connection to Tara as a former student was known, but it was not considered unusual or suspicious. Bo Dukes, too, maintained a low profile in relation to the investigation. His life appeared separate from the events of the past, at least on the surface. But the link between them was constant. And as investigators looked deeper into relationships surrounding the case, that connection would eventually draw attention. Law enforcement began placing greater emphasis on re-interviewing individuals connected to Tara's past, including former students and people within her wider community network. This approach was methodical. It required patience, consistency, and careful observation. Investigators understood that after many years, people's willingness to speak can change. Time can influence memory, but it can also influence decisions. For some, the weight of silence becomes harder to carry. Within this environment, even the smallest shift could open the door to new information. As the investigation quietly progressed, the case started to move again, slowly, but with purpose. The names Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes, once distant from the center of the case, began to move closer into focus. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through a gradual process of review, questioning, and connection. Still, nothing had been confirmed publicly. There were no official statements linking them directly to Tara's disappearance. No clear explanation had been presented. The case remained, in the eyes of the public, unsolved. But behind the scenes, the direction was changing. Investigators were no longer looking only at the night Tara disappeared. They were examining the years that followed, the conversations, the relationships, and the decisions made in silence. And as that process continued, the distance between the past and the present began to narrow. For over a decade, the case had remained a mystery. Now, it was approaching a turning point. What had once been hidden was slowly coming into view, and the answers, when they finally emerged, would bring clarity to questions that had remained unanswered for years, while also revealing the roles played by those who had remained in the background for far too long. For more than a decade, the disappearance of Tara Grinstead remained one of the most puzzling, unsolved cases in Georgia. Investigators had followed leads, revisited evidence, and spoken to countless individuals, yet a clear answer had never been established. That changed in 2017. After years of silence, the case took a decisive turn when new information reached investigators. The shift did not come from a single piece of physical evidence, but from renewed focus on individuals connected to Tara's past. Among those individuals were Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes. By this time, both men were adults, living lives that had moved far beyond their teenage years. However, their connection to each other remained unchanged. That connection would soon become central to the case. As investigators intensified their efforts, Ryan Duke came under closer scrutiny. The process involved detailed questioning, careful examination of past movements, and comparison of statements over time. Eventually, the pressure of the investigation led to a breakthrough. Ryan Duke admitted his involvement. According to his account, the events traced back to the night Tara returned home after the beauty event in 2005. He stated that he entered her home during what he described as an attempted burglary. He had not expected to encounter her. What followed, based on his statement, was a sudden and unplanned situation inside the house. In the course of that encounter, Tara lost her life. Ryan Duke explained that he did not act alone in what happened afterward. He identified Bo Dukes as the person who helped him in the hours that followed. Together, they made decisions aimed at concealing what had taken place. According to the account, this included moving Tara's remains and taking steps to ensure that evidence would not easily be discovered. He further stated that the remains were taken to a remote outdoor location and set on fire in an attempt to remove any trace of identification. This explanation provided, for the first time, a direct narrative of what had happened after Tara disappeared. It answered questions that had remained open for more than 10 years. Investigators worked to verify the details of the statement. They compared it against known evidence, timelines, and previously gathered information. While not every detail could be independently confirmed, the overall account aligned with key aspects of the case. Bo Dukes was also brought in for questioning. During the investigation, it became clear that he had knowledge of the events that followed Tara's death. His role, as described, was not in the initial encounter, but in assisting afterward. Investigators determined that Bo Dukes had been aware of the situation for years, but had not come forward with this information during the earlier stages of the investigation. With these developments, the case that had once seemed impossible to solve was finally moving toward resolution. Ryan Duke was formally charged in connection with Tara Grinstead's death. The legal process that followed focused on the details of his involvement, the circumstances inside the home, and the actions taken afterward. Bo Dukes also faced legal consequences related to his role after the fact, particularly concerning his failure to report what he knew and his involvement in concealing evidence. As the case entered the courtroom, the community that had waited for answers for so long began to see the full picture come into view. The proceedings examined the timeline, the statements, and the decisions made by both men. Testimonies and evidence were presented to establish what had occurred and how the events unfolded. After careful consideration, the court reached its conclusions. Ryan Duke was convicted for his role in the death of Tara Grinstead. The court determined that his actions inside the home led directly to the outcome, and that his efforts to conceal the incident afterward were part of a broader attempt to avoid responsibility. He was sentenced to serve time in prison, bringing a formal legal end to his case. Bo Dukes was also convicted on charges related to his involvement after the incident. His role in assisting and withholding information from authorities over the years was recognized by the court, and he received a separate sentence based on those actions. For Tara's family, the outcome brought a measure of closure, though it could never fully replace what had been lost. They had spent years searching for answers, holding onto hope that one day the truth would be known. Now, they had that truth. For the community of Wasilla, the case left a lasting mark. It changed how people understood their town, their relationships, and the idea of safety that had once felt certain. The story of Tara Grinstead became a reminder that even in the most familiar places, unexpected events can unfold quietly, without immediate notice. It also highlighted the importance of persistence in investigations. What began as a missing person case with no clear direction eventually reached a conclusion through patience, renewed effort, and the willingness to revisit the past. Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes, once names in the background, became central figures in a case that defined a generation in their community. Their actions and the choices that followed shaped the course of an investigation that lasted more than a decade. In the end, the truth did not emerge all at once. It came slowly, built over time through careful work and difficult conversations. And when it finally surfaced, it brought clarity to a mystery that had remained unresolved for far too long. A peaceful day in Arkansas takes an unexpected turn inside Devil's Den State Park. where a routine family outing becomes the center of a complex investigation. A teacher, unanswered questions, and crucial forensic evidence. What really happened? And why did it unfold this way? In 2025, a quiet stretch of wilderness in Arkansas became the center of a case that would draw national attention. Known for its natural beauty and peaceful trails, the area had long been considered a safe place for families and visitors. That perception changed following a deeply unsettling incident involving a young couple and their children. The location was Devil's Den State Park, a place often described as calm, scenic, and family-friendly. Visitors came for hiking, camping, and time away from the noise of daily life. On most days, the park reflected exactly that: open skies, wooded paths, and the steady rhythm of nature. There was little to suggest that it would become linked to a serious criminal investigation. The couple at the center of the case had come to the park with their children, expecting nothing more than a peaceful day outdoors. Like many families, they were there to enjoy time together, surrounded by nature. Their visit followed a familiar pattern: arriving during daylight hours, exploring the area, and keeping close to marked paths. At some point during their time in the park, that sense of normalcy was interrupted. What followed would later be described in official reports as a sudden and deeply distressing event that unfolded in front of their children. Emergency services were contacted, and law enforcement arrived at the scene shortly after. From the beginning, it was clear to investigators that the situation was serious. The area was secured, and initial steps were taken to understand what had happened. Witness accounts, physical evidence, and the condition of the scene all became part of an early effort to reconstruct the timeline. As officers began their work, the presence of children at the scene added a layer of urgency and sensitivity. Authorities had to balance the need for a thorough investigation with the responsibility of handling a situation involving young witnesses. Support services were arranged, and care was taken to ensure that the children were placed in a safe environment. The case quickly moved beyond a routine inquiry. Investigators began collecting forensic evidence, including biological samples, with the goal of identifying a potential suspect. In cases like this, physical evidence often plays a central role, especially when there are limited immediate leads. Within a short period, attention turned toward a man identified as Andrew James McGann, a teacher. At the time, he had no widely known connection to the victims, which made the case more complex. His background, daily activities, and any possible link to the location became key areas of focus for investigators. Law enforcement officials worked methodically, reviewing available data and building a clearer picture of events. Surveillance possibilities, digital records, and witness statements were all examined. The process was careful and deliberate, reflecting the seriousness of the situation. One of the most significant developments came through forensic analysis. DNA evidence collected from the scene was processed and compared against available databases. According to investigators, the results established a connection to McGann. This finding marked a major turning point in the case. At that stage, the investigation shifted from identifying a suspect to building a case. Authorities began to piece together a timeline that could explain how and why McGann might have been present at the park. Questions remained, particularly regarding motive, which was not immediately clear. The lack of an obvious connection between the suspect and the victims raised further concerns. In many cases, relationships or prior interactions provide context, but here, investigators were faced with uncertainty. Understanding motive would require deeper examination, including interviews and analysis of personal and professional background. As news of the case spread, it began to draw public attention. The combination of factors, a public park, a family setting, and the involvement of a teacher, created a sense of unease. Community members and observers across the country followed updates closely, looking for answers. Despite growing attention, officials remained focused on the facts. They avoided speculation and emphasized that the investigation was ongoing. Statements released to the public were measured, confirming key developments while leaving room for further findings. At this point in the timeline, Andrew James McGann had been identified as a person of interest based on forensic evidence. Authorities moved forward with formal steps, preparing to take the case into the next phase. This included securing additional evidence and ensuring that all procedures met legal standards. Meanwhile, the park itself was temporarily affected by the investigation. Certain areas were restricted as officials completed their work. For regular visitors, the shift was noticeable. A place once associated with relaxation had become the focus of a detailed forensic inquiry. The broader community also felt the impact. Incidents like this tend to raise questions about safety, even in locations considered secure. Local authorities addressed these concerns by increasing visibility and reinforcing public safety measures. As the investigation progressed, more information was expected to emerge. Authorities continued working behind the scenes, building a case that would eventually move into the legal system. At this stage, however, many questions remained unanswered, especially the central question of why. In this case is defined by uncertainty and the careful work of investigators. A quiet day in a state park had turned into a complex and high-profile investigation. The identification of a suspect through DNA evidence provided direction, but it also opened the door to deeper questions. Those questions would shape the next phase of the story, as investigators worked to understand not just what happened, but the circumstances that led to it. Following the initial findings, the case moved into a more focused and detailed phase. Investigators in Arkansas began working to establish a clear sequence of events, relying on forensic results, witness accounts, and verified records. The identification of Andrew James McGann through DNA evidence had provided direction, but it also raised new and more complex questions. At this stage, the investigation shifted from discovery to confirmation. Authorities needed to determine how McGann came to be at Devil's Den State Park and whether his presence aligned with the timeline of the incident. Every movement, interaction, and possible connection became part of a larger effort to understand the full picture. Detectives began reviewing McGann's background in detail. His role as a teacher added public interest to the case, but investigators focused strictly on facts. They examined his work history, daily routines, and known associates. The goal was not only to verify his identity, but also to identify any patterns that could explain his actions. At the same time, digital evidence became a key area of focus. Devices such as mobile phones and computers often hold critical information, including location data and communication records. Authorities sought access to these sources through legal channels, aiming to establish whether McGann had visited the park before or had any prior link to the area. According to investigative procedures, location tracking data from mobile devices can sometimes provide precise timelines of a person's movements. This type of information, if available, could help confirm whether McGann was present at the park during the relevant time frame. Witness statements also played an important role. Park visitors and staff who were present that day were asked to share anything they had observed. Even small details, such as noticing an unfamiliar individual or recalling unusual behavior, were considered valuable. Investigators compared these accounts carefully, looking for consistency and any indication that could support the timeline. The presence of the children remained a sensitive aspect of the case. Their accounts, handled with care by trained professionals, were considered important but required a cautious approach. Authorities prioritized their well-being while ensuring that any information gathered was accurate and responsibly documented. As the investigation continued, attention turned to possible motives. In many cases, motive helps provide clarity, but here it remained uncertain. There was no immediate evidence of a personal relationship between McGann and the couple. This lack of connection made it more difficult to explain why the incident occurred. Investigators explored several possibilities. They examined whether there had been any prior encounters, even indirect ones, that could establish a link. They also considered whether the event was spontaneous or planned. Each possibility required a different type of evidence, and none could be confirmed without further analysis. In complex cases like this, investigators often look at behavioral patterns, including past travel history, communication habits, and personal interests, to identify potential motives or triggers. These elements can sometimes reveal connections that are not immediately visible. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued their work. DNA evidence had already played a key role, but additional analysis was conducted to strengthen the case. This included verifying the accuracy of the results and ensuring that all procedures met strict legal standards. Any evidence presented later in court would need to be reliable and clearly documented. Law enforcement officials also worked to establish a detailed timeline. This involved combining all available information, digital data, witness statements, and forensic findings into a single coherent sequence. The timeline would help determine not only when events occurred, but also how they unfolded. As more details were gathered, the case attracted increasing public attention. Media coverage expanded, and discussions began to circulate widely. Despite this, officials remained careful in their communication. They avoided speculation and focused only on confirmed information, emphasizing that the investigation was still ongoing. The community response reflected a mix of concern and anticipation. Residents and regular visitors to Devil's Den State Park found it difficult to reconcile the peaceful nature of the location with the seriousness of the case. Authorities responded by maintaining a visible presence and reassuring the public that safety remained a priority. At this point, legal preparations also began to take shape. Once a suspect is identified and evidence is collected, the case must meet specific legal requirements before moving forward. Prosecutors and investigators worked together to review the findings, ensuring that everything aligned with the standards required for formal charges. In cases involving serious charges, prosecutors typically conduct a detailed review of evidence before presenting it in court, ensuring that each element supports the overall case. This process can take time, but it is essential for maintaining accuracy and fairness. As the investigation progressed, questions about motive remained central. Without a clear explanation, the case continued to generate interest and concern. Authorities did not rule out any possibilities, but made it clear that conclusions would only be drawn based on verified evidence. Andrew James McGann remained at the center of the investigation. With DNA evidence linking him to the scene, the focus was now on understanding his actions and establishing a complete narrative. Investigators continued to gather information, knowing that each detail could contribute to the final outcome. By the end of this phase, the case had evolved from an initial incident into a structured legal matter supported by forensic findings and ongoing analysis. The groundwork had been laid for the next stage, where the evidence would be formally presented and examined within the legal system. The second part of the story is defined by methodical work and unanswered questions. Investigators had identified a suspect and collected key evidence, but the deeper reasons behind the incident were still unclear. As the case moved forward, the focus would shift toward legal proceedings, where those questions would be addressed in detail. As the investigation in Arkansas reached a point where sufficient evidence had been gathered, the case formally entered the legal system. What began as a quiet day in a state park had now developed into a high-profile criminal case, closely followed by both the public and the media. At the center of the proceedings was Andrew James McGann, the teacher identified through DNA evidence during the earlier stages of the investigation. Prosecutors moved forward with capital murder charges, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations and the circumstances surrounding the incident. The legal process began with initial court appearances, where charges were formally presented. During these early hearings, the court reviewed the basis of the case, including the evidence collected by investigators. McGann was provided legal representation, and the proceedings followed established legal protocols to ensure fairness and due process. As the case advanced, prosecutors focused on building a clear and structured argument. Central to their case was the DNA evidence linking McGann to the scene. This forensic finding, combined with the reconstructed timeline and supporting witness accounts, formed the foundation of their position. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, examined the evidence closely, as is standard in any serious criminal case. Their role was to question the reliability and interpretation of the findings, ensuring that every detail met the required legal standards. This process is a critical part of the justice system, designed to test the strength of the case before any final outcome is reached. In capital cases, both sides typically engage expert witnesses, including forensic specialists, to explain technical evidence in a way that the court can fully understand. This can include detailed discussions of how DNA evidence is collected, processed, and matched. As proceedings continued, the question of motive remained a key point of discussion. While the forensic evidence established a connection, understanding why the incident occurred was still part of the broader narrative. Prosecutors aimed to present any supporting context available, while the defense emphasized the importance of clear and direct proof. The courtroom became the setting where all elements of the case were brought together. Evidence was presented step by step, and each detail was examined under legal scrutiny. The timeline developed during the investigation was introduced, outlining the sequence of events as understood by authorities. Witness testimony also played an important role. Individuals connected to the case, including those present in the park that day, provided accounts that helped reinforce the timeline. Their statements were carefully reviewed, with both sides given the opportunity to ask questions and clarify details. The presence of the children during the incident remained a sensitive aspect throughout the proceedings. The court handled this element with particular care, ensuring that their involvement was addressed responsibly and respectfully. As the trial phase progressed, the focus remained on evidence and legal standards. The prosecution sought to demonstrate that the case met the threshold required for conviction, while the defense worked to highlight any uncertainties or gaps. This balance is fundamental to the legal process, ensuring that conclusions are based on verified facts. After a thorough review of all evidence and testimony, the case reached a critical stage. According to reports, Andrew James McGann ultimately provided a formal confession during the later phase of the proceedings, acknowledging his involvement in the incident. This development marked a significant turning point, as it addressed one of the central questions that had remained unresolved. Following the confession, the court moved toward a final decision. The combination of forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the defendant's own statement formed the basis for the outcome. The legal system requires that all these elements be considered together before reaching a conclusion. The court delivered its verdict, finding McGann guilty of the charges presented. This decision reflected the weight of the evidence and the findings established during the trial. With the conviction in place, the case then moved to the sentencing phase. In capital cases, sentencing involves careful consideration of multiple factors, including the nature of the offense and any relevant circumstances. The court reviewed both aggravating and mitigating factors before determining the appropriate sentence. This step ensures that the final decision is balanced and consistent with legal guidelines. At the conclusion of this process, McGann was sentenced under the provisions associated with capital murder. The outcome included the possibility of life imprisonment or the death penalty, as defined by the legal framework in Arkansas. The final sentence reflected the court's assessment of the case and the applicable laws. With the sentencing complete, the case reached its formal conclusion within the trial court. However, legal processes can extend beyond this stage. In many capital cases, the defense has the option to pursue appeals, which can lead to further legal review over time. This ensures that all aspects of the case have been properly considered. For the community and those affected, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of a long and complex process. What began as an unexpected incident in a public park had moved through investigation, legal examination, and final judgment. The case also left a lasting impact on how such incidents are perceived. It highlighted the role of forensic science, particularly DNA evidence, in modern investigations. It also underscored the importance of a structured legal process in addressing serious allegations. Devil's Den State Park, once known primarily for its natural setting, became associated with a case that drew widespread attention. Over time, efforts were made to restore a sense of normalcy, but the events of 2025 remained a point of reference. In the end, the story of the Devil's Den teacher murder case is defined by three phases: the incident, the investigation, and the legal outcome. Each phase contributed to a broader understanding of what occurred and how the system responded. The final part brings closure through the legal process, where evidence was tested, responsibility was determined, and a sentence was delivered in accordance with the law.